all these years, evolutionists have appealed to feathered dinosaurs as the best evidence for bird evolution. If it is true that there are feathered dinosaurs, we should find many examples of creatures that have bird-only and dinosaur-only features all in one creature. And we don't find any of that. There are no feathered dinosaurs. And remember, if there's no feathered dinosaurs, there's no evolution.
The idea that dinosaurs had feathers is nearly universally believed because that's what we see in movies like Jurassic World and even in some science museums. But that's not what you think, Joel. You have a degree in evolutionary biology, and you've actually written quite extensively on dinosaurs in your book, Titans. So tell us why you don't think that dinosaurs evolved and that they had feathers.
That's excellent. In fact, that's one of the questions we get a lot, all the time. Are birds dinosaurs? And I do not believe that is so. But before we can address that question, we need to answer another more important question. We need to define what is a dinosaur. So a dinosaur is simply a reptile that walks on land in an upright position.
What do you mean by walks upright? What about Triceratops or some of the long-necked dinosaurs? Don't they walk upright?
They walk on four legs, but those creatures still walk in an upright position. And what do I mean by that? Is that dinosaurs have a very unique anatomy where the limbs grow down straight and they walk upright. So if you think about the way that a crocodile walks, the arm kind of sprawls out from the side and it kind of walks in a waddle in that position. Dinosaurs is different because they have a unique anatomy that allows them to walk upright. The legs grow straight down.
So what you're saying is that they have a completely different skeletal system between a dinosaur and other reptiles.
That's right. And the skeleton actually comes down to the hip socket. So if you think about our hip socket, you have this picture in your mind of like a cup and a ball for a hip socket. With dinosaurs, it's different. Dinosaurs have a very unique hip socket. It's what we call a perforated acetabulum. That's just a fancy way of saying an open hip socket. So in dinosaurs, you have three bones that come together to form a hole. And so here you have the hole there. And then you have the femur, the thigh bone. And in dinosaurs, the head of the thigh bone, the joint, the hip joint, sticks out perpendicular and it fits into this hole. And now the creature walks in an upright position. So that's why it's different from a crocodile. And that's why crocodiles are not lizards. In crocodiles, they don't have the completely open acetabulum. The arms grow out and they waddle about.
So that means that crocodiles are not dinosaurs because they have this different hip socket.
That's right. And so this special hip socket, the open acetabulum, is only unique to dinosaurs. And that's why crocodiles are not dinosaurs.
All right, so using this definition that you just talked about, the open hip socket, that means that a bird is not a dinosaur then. Is that correct?
Exactly, because birds, they have a closed hip socket, a closed acetabulum. And in some of the extinct birds, you do have a partially open acetabulum. So what does that mean? If you think sometimes you have a little well, and at the bottom of the well, there's a small hole. But that's very different from a dinosaur, which has a completely open hip socket.
All right, if birds are not dinosaurs because they have a different hip socket, is there another way that would allow us to distinguish them from a dinosaur?
Well, there are many ways. But first, you must be wondering, if they are so different in the hip socket, then why is it that evolutionists say that birds are dinosaurs? And that's because they actually use a different definition. So the traditional definition was the same thing that I told you. A dinosaur is a reptile that walks upright on land. But evolution, they believed in common ancestry of all things. So everything evolved from a common source. So in the evolutionary model, you normally have an evolutionary tree, right? And in the evolution model, from dinosaurs, it evolved into the modern birds that we see today. And that's why the modern birds in that tree nest within what we would call Dinosauria or dinosaurs. So in the model, look, hey, birds are within Dinosauria. They are dinosaurs. But that's a very different definition from the definition that we gave earlier on.
So what else would allow us to say that that's a dinosaur, that's a bird?
So dinosaurs, if you think about the way they are, see, evolutionists believe that the theropod dinosaurs, most evolutionists believe that the theropod dinosaurs continue to evolve into the modern birds that we see today. But if you think about the theropod dinosaurs, These are the ones with the big legs and small arms. They really have the wrong kind of anatomy to turn into a modern bird. So when you think about a dinosaur tail, you think of this huge muscular yet flexible tail. And when you look at the bones of this tail, they are huge. They have all these spiky, bony projections. Those are muscle attachment sites. That's a dinosaur tail.
How does that differ from a bird's tail?
Well, most modern birds don't have much of a tail. They have a very short tail. And when you look at their anatomy, at the end of the tail, you have maybe 4 to 9 vertebrae, and then you have a pygostyle. And so what's that? This is the cap or the end of the tail. And this end of the tail is normally just a few bones that are fused together. So they are inflexible, they're very thin. Again, very different from a dinosaur tail. And they're just there. So they're not flexible and they're thin. There are not many muscle attachment sites. Now, what's interesting is some of these extinct birds, like Archaeopteryx, they have a tail. But the tail is very much a bird configuration.
Joel, you were just talking about how there's a distinction in dinosaurs and birds based on their tail. What other differences might they have?
So we have looked at individual traits so far, especially skeletal differences. So we have looked at the hip socket, we have looked at the tail, but we can look at the soft tissue, look at the body plan, the way that this creature moves, the way that they breathe and things like that. And some of these things are not very well preserved in the fossil record. But we can look at creatures and say, hey, look, that's a reptile, this is a bird. What are the differences? Because if it's really different, then it doesn't make sense for you to group these two creatures into one. And so the concept that I would like to bring up is this idea of an integrated biological system.
What do you mean by that?
Well, one example, think about the way that a reptile breathes. So a reptile, the lungs, we are mammals, but they have very similar lungs in the sense that the lungs expands, it contracts. It has a diaphragm that controls that breathing. The air goes in and out in most cases. So that is a reptile lung. Now when we look at a bird has a very different way of breathing. Birds have a one-way lung system. The air goes in one way and it flows. Like a circuit, like a runner running on around the stadium. So you have a two-way lung in most cases for reptiles, and in birds you have a one-way lung. Very different. And so another thing that's interesting about the bird lungs is that a bird lung doesn't expand. So when we breathe, our lungs expand and contract because we have a diaphragm. Birds don't have that. The lungs are kind of static. It doesn't expand at all.
All right, so if they don't expand and contract, how do they breathe?
No, birds have air sacs around the body, 9 air sacs. So you have air sacs around the body, and so you have 9 of them. And what are air sacs? Evolutionists like to look at that and say air sacs. Anything that there's a space, they call it an air sac. When I'm talking about air sacs here, I'm talking about air pumps, a pump. So the lung of a bird doesn't stretch, doesn't expand that much, but you have air pumps that pump this air around that body. And that again is only unique to birds.
So what did the skeptics have to say about this?
So one of the things that I pointed out is that birds have a one-way lung system, while most reptiles have a two-way lung. The air goes in and out in 2 ways, bidirectional. So one of the things that skeptics will say that, hey, you talk about two-way lung system, but when you look at an alligator, which is a reptile, it has a one-way air system. The air goes in one circuit, one round, so to speak. And I would say, yes, that's true, but an alligator still have a reptilian lung. So remember what I say about the reptilian lung? It expands, it contracts, it has a diaphragm, and alligator has that. The only difference is that the air goes in one direction now. And another thing that's interesting in alligator is that they have in the bottom or the back of the belly, they have like an air container, an air. Evolutionists will call it air sacs, but this is not an air pump, it's just an air storage. And this is helpful for an alligator because when an alligator is underwater, it doesn't breathe. That allows the air storage for it to continue breathing. But an alligator has a reptilian lung, which is very different, expand, contract, different from what we find in birds.
Are there any other differences?
Another thing that is unique to birds is that they have pneumatic bones. So what do you mean by pneumatic bones? Well, most evolutionists will talk about hollow bones. But actually, almost every bone in our body is hollow except for our ear bones. You see, bones can be filled with marrow, bones can be filled with blood and other things. But when we talk about pneumatic bones, we're not just talking about hollow bones with air, we're talking about air passages. So earlier on, we mentioned that there are air sacs, and it pumps the air. the pneumatic bones that are air passages is part of the way it breathes. The air flows through that, and it's important for things like heat regulation. And that is unique to birds. Okay, so Dons, we have already mentioned the way it breathes, the one-way lung system with the air sacs, which is unique to birds. We have talked about the pneumatic bones, which are linked up to the way it breathes in the lungs. But there's another thing. We can look at the femur, the thigh of a bird. Sometimes if you look at a bird, you must be wondering, hey, why does a bird have a knee that bends in the opposite direction? Have you ever thought about that?
Right, that looks kind of weird.
Yeah, that's kind of weird, but that's not its knee. That's actually the ankle. You see, the knee of a bird is actually much higher up in its body. And the thigh in birds is actually pretty much inside the torso of a bird. It is horizontal, it's rigid, it doesn't swing much. There are lots of connective tissue that hold it in place. So the next time you buy a rotisserie chicken from the supermarket, cut into the thigh, extract the thigh out. You need to cut into the torso or the body of the chicken to extract the thigh, because most birds, their thighs are partially within the torso of a bird. Why is that? Because earlier on I mentioned the pneumatic bones. The pneumatic bones are found inside the thigh as well. In other words, the thighs are part of the way it breathes. See, in dinosaurs, how are dinosaurs' legs like? Well, we know, right? Jurassic Park, their legs are like us. The thighs are outside the body, they're external. When they run, they swing their thighs, their thigh bone.
If evolution was true, how could they run like that without interfering with their breathing?
Yeah, I don't think it can, because if that's a bird and they swing their thighs like that, that will tear the entire lung system apart. So here we have what I call the integrated biological systems. We have three very complex biological systems that are all linked up together. How do you evolve from one to another? And in fact, if they're so different, why are we even grouping them together as if they are the same thing?
All right, Joel, you've mentioned a lot of biological differences between a dinosaur and a bird, but why does any of this matter as far as whether or not a dinosaur could evolve into a bird?
Well, first of all, if there are feathered dinosaurs, that would not really be an issue for the creation model, because God could have created feathered dinosaurs. He could have created land creatures with feathers. So that's not really an issue for us. But most evolutionists believe that dinosaurs evolved into modern-day birds. And if that is the case, then feathers must have appeared somewhere along the way. So all these years, evolutionists have appealed to feathered dinosaurs as the best evidence for bird evolution. If we don't have feathered dinosaurs, everything just collapses.
So then, what scientific evidence do evolutionists point to say that dinosaurs did evolve into birds?
Well, this goes back to the 1970s. So there was a scientist, John Ostrom. John Ostrom believed that Deinonychus, or a similar-like creature, evolved into the modern birds that we see today. So Deinonychus, what's that? Well, if you watch my favorite movie, Jurassic Park, Velociraptor, right? That isn't really Velociraptor. So when the makers of the movie made that, they make Deinonychus. That's the one we're familiar with. And they name it after the smaller cousin, Velociraptor. See, the Velociraptor is about the size of a large dog. And so they made Deinonychus, but they say Deinonychus, it sounds really boring. So they made Deinonychus and named it after the smaller cousin, Velociraptor. So picture Deinonychus in your mind, that creature that in Jurassic Park was known as Velociraptor. Of course, now in modern museums, they put feathers on that creature. So that was in the 1970s. Now when we get to 1996, there's a key discovery here. They found this dinosaur called Ceratosaurus. So what's that? This is a dinosaur, not a bird. And we know that because on this fossil itself, in its belly, there is actually a dark patch on the fossil. And we know that's its liver. And because of the placement of the liver and the way it interacts with the diaphragm, we know that this bird had a reptilian lung. This is a dinosaur, not a bird. But what is interesting is that in this creature, on the fossil, on the back of its head to the tail, we see a very fuzzy tuft that looks like fur or like hair. So evolutionists point to that and they say, hey, look, that's evidence of feathered dinosaur. But we look at that and we say, no, that's more like collagen, decayed skin collagen.
So what is this collagen that you're talking about? I know I need more collagen, but what is it in dinosaurs?
That's right. So we know collagen from the supplements that people eat. But collagen is just a very common structural protein. So in our body, collagen will make up maybe 20 to 30% of the proteins that we have today. It's a tough, fibrous protein that gives strength to our body parts. And collagen, when it breaks down, when it decays, it can take on many forms. So it's fibrous. So there are maybe 4 or 5 major forms of collagen, some say more. But what is interesting is this. The dinosaur fuzziness, which evolutionists claim are proto-feathers, on its way to evolving to real feathers, they really resemble the 4 or 5 forms of collagen, of decayed skin collagen.
And all that shows up in a fossil?
Yeah, sometimes you can see that on the fossil itself, and sometimes these collagen fibers even appear under the scales of the dinosaur, which tells you they cannot be feathers. Those are just decayed skin.
So are there evolutionists who agree with your assessment that what appears to just be dinosaur fuzz is just collagen?
Well, most evolutionists believe that birds are dinosaurs, but there are a few exceptions, and one exception to that is Professor Alan Fiducia. So who is he? Well, he's a bird expert, a professor emeritus, but he doesn't believe that the theropod dinosaurs evolved into birds. But he's an evolutionist, so he believes that the birds actually derived or they evolved from a much earlier line of reptilian creatures called archosaur. And the reason why, because he looks at the anatomy and he says that no, dinosaurs, the theropod dinosaurs, they have the wrong kind of anatomy to be even call them birds. But you see, evolutionists have, after all these years, they've always been promoting the idea that the dinosaurs evolved into the modern birds that we see today. They say birds are dinosaurs. If there are no feathered dinosaurs, that's a huge problem for them. Because you see, in their model, if the dinosaurs evolved into the modern birds, then somewhere along the way, you must have evolved feathers. So where's the evidence for that? So this is a huge problem for the dinosaur to bird evolution model.
What would we expect to see if there had been feathered dinosaurs, or if dinosaurs had evolved into birds?
That's an excellent question. So earlier on, I mentioned that in the fossil record, that there are real birds with feathers. Archaeopteryx, for example, that is a bird that's not a dinosaur. Microraptor is another example of that. Confuciusornis is another one. So there are real birds in the fossil record. And those are the ones with real feathers. At the same time, we have dinosaurs, not birds, dinosaurs, that has fuzzy structure, which we say look exactly like skin collagen. They are decayed. So evolutionists take these two groups and they lump them together as feathered dinosaurs. So how should we think about that? Well, I would like to propose a way of thinking about that. If you look at the birds, we need to identify what are the bird-only characteristics, things that are unique to birds. So we have already covered some of that. We have looked at the hip socket, we have looked at the tail, the way it's configured, we have looked at the lungs, we look at the pneumatic bones, and we look at the internal thigh. Unique to birds. So we call that on one end the zone 3, bird-only features. On the left side, if you draw 2 overlapping circles on the left side, you have the dinosaur-only features. So dinosaur-only on one side, on one circle, on the right side, another circle, bird-only features. If you let them overlap, in the middle part, if it is true that there are feathered dinosaurs, we should find many examples, not one or two, many examples of creatures that have bird-only and dinosaur-only features, all in one creature. And we don't find any of that. So earlier on, I did mention that evolutionists take these real feathers in real flight birds and they conflate them with the dinosaur that has a fuzzy structure. And they conflate them together as one. And that's unfortunate because when you do an analysis of these creatures, your result is only as good as the information that goes in. So we say garbage in, garbage out. So in that model, if you conflate both of these together, guess what will happen in the end? At the end of the day, when you get your final results out, they will say that, hey, look, there's feathered dinosaurs. But that's because you have wrong data or bad data that's going in there. So when we say that it's decayed collagen in dinosaur fossils, to be honest, it doesn't seem very convincing. But then when you look at these actual fossils under the fossil record, that changes everything. So why do I say that? So earlier on, I mentioned the professor Alan Fiducia. So he said that this is just decayed skin collagen. How did he come to that conclusion? Well, Alan Fiducia and another very famous scientist, Tiergarten Solayalingam. So they just call him Professor Solly. So this second guy, Professor Solly, he just passed away 1 or 2 years ago. Who is he? He's an expert on skin tissue, skin, hair, feathers, and things like that. His whole career is based on that. He actually wrote 2 postgraduate volumes, textbooks, teaching people about this very thing. And so they came together and they worked on this. And what they did is that he took carcasses of sharks, dolphins, whales, placed them under the ground, buried them for 1 year. And after 1 year, he opened up and looked at their decaying carcasses. Guess what he found?
What did he find?
He found the exact same fuzzy structures forming. They are identical and cannot be distinguished from the so-called dinosaur fuzz. And then he looked at extinct fossils of marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs, mosasaurs, and these are creatures that swim in the ocean. They don't have feathers. He found the exact same structures being preserved on their fossil itself. So that's confirmation that this is not collagen fibers, this is just skin tissue. And so when you look at this dinosaur fossil, it looks like he has something fuzzy there. Yes, it does. But hey, look at the decaying dolphin carcass. The same wavy structure that you see there. Hey, look at that. That looks like it's a frayed tissue. Yeah, it looks a bit like feathers. Yeah, it does. But wait, look at the decayed dolphin. You get the exact same things.
So what I'm hearing from you, Joel, is overwhelming evidence that dinosaurs could not have evolved with feathers. Is that right?
That's exactly the case. So we have 2 very clear groups. One, that are flight creatures with real flight feathers, and the other ones that are reptilian dinosaur creatures that has this fuzzy structure. So I mentioned Tiergarten, who did these experiments. Skeptics, they come along. So they say, oh no, those pictures that you produce from these marine fossils, say, oh, that's not collagen fibers. Because on these fossils, they look like they're little channels, and say those channels are not collagen fibers in there. They say that this must have been caused by a pneumatic pen. You see, when you prepare a fossil, you use a special pen. They say, oh, look, those are actually scratch marks in the fossil. That doesn't hold up. Do you know why?
No.
Some of these fossils under the microscope, you can even see the details. It's very well preserved. Like I say, they are under the scale sometimes. And these are raised 3-dimensional shape. They're long fiber structure. This is part of the fossil itself. It's not a scratch mark.
All right, so under the microscope then, would feathers look different than collagen?
Exactly, because when we look at a feather, you have a central barb and you have all these barbules at the side. We know what a feather looks like. And when we look at these other structures, they look heavy structures. And like I say, there are many forms of decayed collagen. But when we look at these decaying dinosaur fossils, we see all the same 4 or 5 forms of so-called dinosaur fuzz that are identical in every way. So Tiergarten, the scientist I mentioned earlier on, he said this. He's convinced that people who reject the idea that those are collagen fibers, he's convinced that those people have never actually really studied what real collagen look like.
Joel, that was great information that you shared with us, but it's hard to hear anything about dinosaurs in our secular world that doesn't directly link it to millions of years and evolution. So as a parent hearing this for the first time, what's the important thing to really remember about all this information you've shared?
Well, so just give a quick summary of what we have looked at. So we have looked at anatomy, the hip socket, the tail of dinosaur and birds are very different. We've looked at the lungs, the pneumatic bones, and the thigh. These are integrated biological systems. They're all linked to one. Birds are very different from reptiles. And then we saw the collagen fibers on the dinosaur body. Those are not feathers. So finally, we see 2 overlapping circles, bird only on one side, dinosaur only on one side, and we show in the center that if it is true that there are feathered dinosaurs, we should find many individuals with bird-only and dinosaur-only features in a single creature, and we don't have a single one. And since birds and dinosaurs are so different, I mean, look at the way the whole body is built. If it's so different, it doesn't make sense for you to group these creatures together.
So with all of this biological evidence that you've presented here, this should help encourage people to know that we don't have to just take for granted what's put before us as evolution is fact and dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. That maybe what the Bible has to say is actually the truth.
That's right, because I think dinosaurs have been used as a gateway to introduce evolution to many kids. You know, I go to talks, kids will come up to me. They say, hey, look, chickens are dinosaurs. No, it isn't. Okay, we don't have to be afraid of dinosaurs because when we train ourselves in this area, we can use this as a way to reach out to our kids and our families and show them, hey, look, dinosaurs actually show what the Bible says very well. It doesn't prove evolution at all. There are no feathered dinosaurs. And remember, if there's no feathered dinosaurs, there's no evolution there.
So this kind of solid, scientific, evidence-based information is not readily available in many places. But where could someone who wanted to know more about it go?
One place I would recommend going is check out the book that I co-authored with Dr. Jonathan Safety. It's called Titans. And we have more than 2 chapters that address this whole issue of where the birds are dinosaurs. Another place you can go to is creation.com. That's our website. Thousands of articles on this. And check out Creation Magazine. So in Creation Magazine, in almost every issue, it's a quarterly magazine, we always have an issue that talks about dinosaurs. So this is a place that you can use to equip yourself to reach out to your families.
As Joel stated, Creation Magazine is a great opportunity to get this kind of information for yourself and others, and you can do that when you click in the description below. And when you do so, you'll even get a free gift. Joel, thanks so much.
Thank you.